David J. Brown has interviewed the world's most creative and controversial thinkers. These interviews are chronicled in Voices from the Edge, Conversations on the Edge of the Apocalypse, Mavericks of Medicine, and his first book of interviews, Mavericks of the Mind, which has just been reissued in expanded form. David asks the big questions, such as what is spirituality, and what do you think happens to consciousness after physical death? I met with him recently in his cabin, surrounded by the latest issue of Mavericks of the Mind, to ask him some big questions. David, thank you so much for inviting me here to your cabin to talk about this interesting subject.
It's such a pleasure for you to be here. Thank you, Mel.
Yeah, David, one of the things that really intrigues me is that you've had a near-death experience. Could you tell us what that was like?
Yeah, well, first of all, death is something that I've been interested in for a long time. I think that it's a wonderful exercise of the imagination to think about what happens after you die. And my own personal experience with coming close to death involved being in a car where the steering column snapped. I was going around a mountain turn, going to the Santa Cruz Mountains, and the column of my car snapped, and the steering wheel was no longer attached to the driving wheels. And I put my foot on the brake as hard as I possibly could to try to stop from going off the cliff, but went flying off the side of the cliff. And when that happened, time slowed down progressively, and when I went off the cliff, it seemed that time had just completely stopped. And I was hovering suspended in space, and it seemed like there was a question that was poised to me, and the question was, do you want to continue living? And out of the depth of my soul, the depth of my spirit, I felt this just incredible, lust for life and love for life and passion for being alive. And in the moment that I chose to be alive, I immediately found myself back in my physical body, back in the car, and the front of the car impacted on the mountain cliff and then rolled down the side of the cliff. And when I called the police later, when people came to help, people had told me that nobody had gone over that cliff before and actually lived. And miraculously, I actually climbed up out of it. And to this day, it's been something that has really helped me to appreciate life and appreciate the time that we have here tremendously.
Yeah. When did this happen?
This was about 5 or 6 years ago.
Uh-huh. Did you have any of the classical symptoms of a near-death experience?
Well, the classical symptoms of what happens after a near-death experience were what happened to me. Mm-hmm. I didn't have an out-of-body experience, or I didn't have any entity contact, or I didn't feel like I was really meeting God. But what I did feel was after the experience, I felt a tremendous sense of appreciation for life. And I lost all fear of death, all fear of everything, getting up on stage in front of people, getting in front of people, talking. Nothing scared me anymore, and the tiniest, littlest things, like seeing the way sunlight would just flicker through the leaves on a tree, would bring me to tears. It was so beautiful, and I was so happy just to be alive and to be able to experience whatever it was I was experiencing. Right. So it was a tremendous lesson in appreciation.
Mm-hmm. You're also quite interested in psychedelics, especially ayahuasca, and I know that there's this idea going around that DMT involved in ayahuasca causes that experience, but it also causes some of the phenomena that's associated with the near-death experience. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think there's some interesting evidence to support what you're talking about. DMT, dimethyltryptamine, is one of the most powerful psychedelic substances that human beings are aware of, and it's naturally found in the human brain. And nobody knows what it's doing there. It's naturally found in the human brain, in many animal brains, and all throughout the entire plant and animal kingdom it's found. And nobody knows what it does. But we do know that when we give it to people, Dr. Rick Strausman at the University of New Mexico did a study between 1990 and 1995 where he gave dimethyltryptamine to volunteers who had had psychedelic experiences prior. And the similarity between the experiences was extraordinary, and the similarity between the experiences and alien abduction experiences, near-death experiences, and mystical experiences was also uncanny. Mm-hmm. So he postulated the possibility that perhaps it is DMT that's found naturally in the brain that's mediating these types of experiences when they occur in a non-drug setting.
Mm-hmm. Do you know of any evidence to confirm this?
Well, the only evidence that we really have is that, number one, DMT is found in the brain, and there's precursory material in the pineal gland, but we don't know if that's really where it's manufactured or not, but it is in the brain. And the other evidence is that people who have had near-death experiences, and they report what happens to them, a lot of those aspects of those experiences are very similar to people who were given dimethyltryptamine in Dr. Rick Strassman's laboratory. So some of the similarities are out-of-body experiences, contact with other entities that are not human, and contact with a type of divine intelligence or a feeling of love being profused throughout the universe.
Right. And you have some experience with ayahuasca yourself?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
In what ways could that be similar to a near-death experience?
Well, the actual experience itself, there are some similarities, though it's not a direct correlation. Some people experience out-of-body and entity contact and experiences like that with ayahuasca. But I think what's really most similar about the two experiences is how they affect you in the long term. I think that the outcome of the ayahuasca experience and the outcome of the near-death experience is one in which it helps you to appreciate how precious each moment is that we're here.
I remember that Houston Smith said, it's not a matter of altered states, it's more a matter of altered traits.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's wonderful. Yes. He's wonderful, Houston. Yeah, I love him.
So when we had a phone conversation before our meeting today, you said that, for example, in your research, the life review of a near-death experience is not, it has some similarities, but there are differences. There's also what you might call a life review on ayahuasca. So what are the similarities and the differences in regard to something that could be called a life review or examining your life?
Well, according to Charles Tart, who's a psychologist who's an expert on altered states, an expert on these things, he told me that the main difference is really that the duration of the experience and also how quickly you come back from a natural near-death experience as opposed to a drug-induced near-death experience. When you experience a life review on ayahuasca, it doesn't happen in a flash like it does naturally. When somebody's in an accident, a car accident or something like that, the life review happens almost instantaneously. And in a psychedelic experience, it happens over a period of a half an hour or an hour, and people can kind of leisurely review and look at different aspects of their life. And it doesn't necessarily appear in a chronological order either. It's more like it loosens up old memories and it allows people to reflect back on aspects of their life they may have forgotten. But what's been reported with people who have had near-death experiences is that they feel that they actually remember every single aspect of their life shown in ultra-high fast speed like that. And not only do they report that they experienced their entire life, but they also often report they experienced not only all the feelings that went with it, but the feelings of the people around them. So they know who they hurt and who they loved and who was affected by their emotions. So how these things happen, it's only a mystery. But there certainly is some type of interesting correlation between what happens with psychedelics and what happens with a near-death experience.
What you just said makes me wonder, how can all this information, all this memory be contained in the brain and happen instantaneously? What thoughts do you have about that?
Well, I wonder how much of what we think of as ourselves is really composed of as the brain, and whether ourselves is something larger than the brain or not. I think that the brain, as a computer-like organ, has an enormous capacity for memory. So it really doesn't surprise me. I mean, we're understanding now with artificial intelligence, every couple of years we're storing greater and greater amounts of information in smaller and smaller spaces. But I think what you're really getting at with that question is whether or not information is really stored in the brain or not, or whether there might be some type of field or some type of out-of-body storage capacity that we're able to tap into, because it seems that people are able to experience consciousness or mental processes without the brain operating. So there's evidence for that. And when I worked with Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who I guess we'll be talking about later,
yes.
He really helped me to understand that that memory is an inherent process of the universe. And because everything has a kind of memory to it, it's not that unusual that human beings would develop a very sophisticated capacity for dealing with it.
Right. So again, the question you ask in nearly all your interviews is, what do you think happens to consciousness after physical death? How would you answer this question?
Gosh, Mel, I think about this question every single day. It's a meditation for me. It's a way that I exercise my imagination, and the reason that I ask it to so many people, besides the fact that I'm just so curious about it, is I really like to see people use their imagination. I think that the common answers that you hear for this sort of question, heaven, hell, reincarnation, union with the mind of God, or simply atheistic nothingness, I think show real lack of imagination more than anything else. Mm-hmm. I think that this lack of imagination is probably attributable to the fact that people are so frightened of the death process, and people don't really want to think about it very carefully. But I think about it all the time, and I don't really have any fixed idea or fixed belief about what happens, and I'm really looking forward to it in a way. I really, I don't want to die tomorrow, but there's a part of me that is very, very curious, and I definitely want to be completely conscious during the experience, and want to be able to examine what's happening, and looking forward to the surprise. But I guess if you really pressed me, I tend to suspect that what happens after death is largely influenced by what you believe happens. I think that that's what happens throughout your life, is that what you believe largely influences your life, and I think that carries on after you die, that your belief about the experience has an influence on it, and that Christians go to heaven, and sinners go to hell, and people think they get reincarnated, and you go through some kind of process, I think, that's actually tied to what you believe to a certain degree, and then you sort of get caught up in the bigger collective beliefs of others.
Does that say anything about how we experience life now?
Absolutely. How we think about death definitely affects how we live our life. The consequences of our actions, whether they're going to be tomorrow, next week, or another lifetime, certainly somebody who is Hindu and believes in reincarnation is going to be thinking about their actions in a much longer term respect than somebody who thinks in an atheistic fashion that everything ends.
What answer from the people that you've interviewed has most impressed you?
Well, that's an interesting question.
What do you think happens to consciousness after physical death? What answer has most impressed you?
There's been a couple that made an impression on me. When I interviewed John Robbins, the author of the book Diet for a New America, he answered the question in just one word and just said, "I think it celebrates." And I thought that was a wonderful answer. The answers that I really loved were the answers where people, I could tell, were really using their imagination and really trying to think in an original way about it. For example, when I interviewed Terence McKenna, the ethnobotanist, I loved his answer. It was one of my very favorites. He talked about how as you actually approach death, the process of time seems to be slowing down, and that the actual moment of death as you approach it is the reliving of your own birth. And after you die, your consciousness then spreads out and spreads into your parents and into your children and into your grandparents and into your grandchildren, and it keeps spreading until it finally encompasses the entire web of life, where it then unifies and synchronizes and harmonizes with this process until it then shrinks down and comes back down to another incarnation. Mm-hmm. I thought that was very interesting. That was one of my favorites.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites too, after having read so many of the responses of your interviewees. Was there a time in your life when you remembered that this question really became urgent?
I think that I really got interested in what happens to consciousness after death right around the time that I got interested in psychedelics. Psychedelics.
When was that?
This was right around the age of 15 or 16, maybe. Uh-huh. I had my first psychedelic experience when I was 16, but I'd been experimenting with cannabis before that and meditation before that. So I was beginning to loosen the boundaries and beginning to, let's say, dissolve my ego or my personality a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I think with that came a curiosity about what happens to consciousness after the death of the physical body.
David, do you think the materialistic, reductionistic view now prevailing in science has limited our view of a best possible future?
Yes, absolutely. I think that having a materialistic, reductionistic view limits the direction that research goes. And I think also it excludes having a spiritual perspective. Let me give you an example of a recent study that was done by my friend and colleague, Dr. Gene Radin, that I think steps outside the normal paradigm and offers some interesting, compelling evidence for why scientists should be looking into these other areas. What Dean Radin did was he showed people videotapes of images. And people would sit at a screen, And they were hooked up to a galvanic skin response, so their electrical conductivity of their skin was being continuously measured. And as they were sitting in front of the television screen or the computer screen, the screen would be blank and be continuously measuring their electrical conductivity. And every so often, a image would flash on the screen. Before the image flashed on the screen, the person's electrical measurable electrical conductivity would change if the image was shocking or startling in some way before they actually saw it. So in other words, if there was an image of a sexual or violent image, something that had a very profound emotional impact, the person's galvanic skin response would actually shift and go up as if they were seeing the image 5 seconds before they actually saw it. And most of the imagery was just landscapes and people's faces and something that wouldn't really arouse somebody's emotions very much. But every time they would show a violent or sexually arousing image, the person's skin conductivity would change 5 seconds before they actually showed it. Wow. And this is a repeatable experiment. It's been repeated several times by other researchers. So there is absolutely no explanation in conventional science for this phenomena that has been very, very carefully tested and really been shown as a fact of nature. So how do we explain this? And this is the sort of research, I think, that should be a springboard for all these wonderful studies that we could be doing into psychic phenomena.
Mm-hmm. If memories can be stored outside of the brain, then this brings up some spiritual questions, and we might want to look at what people have said in the spiritual traditions of the past. So if someone were to ask you, do you believe in God, how would you respond to that?
Well, I would respond by saying not in the conventional sense, for sure. I don't believe there's an old man sitting in the sky looking down at us and making everything happen and judging everything that we do. I've thought about the question quite a bit, and it's one of the questions that I've also asked the people that I've interviewed almost as much as the question about what do you think happens to consciousness after death. I suspect from my experiences with psychedelics and mystical experiences I've had that my consciousness is not separate from the rest of the universe, that it's an illusion that I feel like a separate being, and that my consciousness is really ultimately unified with something much larger than myself. And I think that much larger sense of consciousness is often what people refer to as God. I'm not sure if it's exactly the same thing as a designing intelligence, and that's also another different thing. I tend to think that the universe is organized the same way the internet is, that there is lots of organizing intelligences all around, but there's no one big organizing intelligence at the top, that intelligences arise out of nature spontaneously, and they start creating and directing as they do, and they die and they're reborn and revised, and it's constantly happening at all levels of nature, I think, from the atomic to the galactic. So I think that what people sometimes consider divine or consider God is aspects of our own consciousness or aspects of the nature's consciousness that is much larger than us, say the biosphere or the solar system or the galaxy or the universe. I mean, being able to consciously identify with those things, I think, is what people refer to when they are talking about God. But I don't think that the entire universe was designed and is running clockwork and somebody's behind it all. I think that that's kind of silly.
Right. When I asked Houston Smith about where the near-death experience takes place, he paused for a while and then cited William James's idea about the brain being a reducing valve, that in order to live in a three-dimensional world, the brain has to filter out our basic omniscience. So how do you feel about this?
I think that's a wonderful metaphor. I love that metaphor that the brain is a reducing valve. I think the first person who came up with that idea was Aldous Huxley.
I think so. Yeah.
In his book Doors of Perception, there's actually a part of the brain called the reticular activating cortex that is responsible for filtering out information in the brain. And some people think that during a psychedelic experience, that filtering mechanism gets opened up wider, so more information rushes in that's normally filtered out.
Right. That's exactly what I was going to ask you about, whether the psychedelic experience perhaps partially removes the lid from the reducing valve, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I also remember that Steve Jobs said that his LSD experience was one of the one or two most meaningful experiences in his life. And I can't help but think that psychedelics may unleash in some way creativity. So what is your feeling about this?
Well, there's scientific evidence to support that, Mel. There's quite a bit. One of my mentors, Dr. Oscar Janiger, did some research back in the early 60s with LSD, giving it to artists and seeing how it affected their creativity. He actually gave it to about 100 artists and had them paint a doll before taking the LSD and then under the influence of the LSD. And then had an independent panel of art critics judge the paintings, not knowing which paintings were done under the influence of LSD and which ones weren't. And the ones that were done under the influence of LSD were judged to be more creative. There was also a study done up in Northern California that showed that when they gave LSD, or I think it was mescaline actually, I'm sorry, it wasn't LSD, it was mescaline, when they gave it to engineers and scientists and people that were involved in some type of problem solving, that it actually helped to, according to their own reports, it actually helped to accelerate their problem solving abilities. Mm-hmm. So there's scientific evidence to actually support that process, that it enhances creativity, and certainly from my own experience I would tell you that it has unquestionably enhanced my own creativity, and so many people that I've known have reported this to me that it's barely something that I question.
How has your research into the possibility of consciousness beyond death changed your life?
I don't know that it's changed my life all that much.
How has it impacted your life? How's that affected your life?
Yeah, well, it's given me a lot more to think about. I mean, it was something I was thinking about before I started interviewing people, before I started getting responses. It was something I've thought about and continue to think about. But I guess the more people that I've spoken to about it, the more responses that I've gotten, the more perspectives that I've tried to integrate, the more of a mystery it becomes for me, I think, and the less I feel like I know. I feel like the more I learn about anything, I feel like the greater the mystery becomes. So the greatest mystery of all, death, seems like a bigger mystery than ever.
Right. And do you find that you're more and more becoming comfortable with life being a mystery?
Yes and no. It's funny. Yeah, it's funny because I feel like I sometimes make incredible progress, and that I feel like I've become comfortable with everything being uncertain. And then sometimes something happens, and you suddenly realize that you're not quite as comfortable with uncertainty and mystery as you are, as you thought you were. So it's hard to say. But yeah, I think that compared to most people, I'm pretty comfortable with uncertainty and mystery, and I accept that and really don't try to rush for answers or rush for some kind of fix-all or spiritual band-aid. I really would like to know what the truth is.
Okay, well, David, thank you so much for expressing your views on creativity and consciousness and the possibility of something existing beyond physical death. You've given us a lot to think about.
Thank you very much, Mel. It's been a great pleasure.
Okay, thank you.